We often spend our lives building walls out of stones we didn't even choose to carry, believing that safety is found in silence and distance. But the most profound transformations rarely happen in the comfort of our own echo chambers. They begin when we find the courage to sit across from the person we've been told to fear. This is a story about what happens when we stop being polite and finally start being real with one another. The town of Oakhaven was a place where the sun seemed to hit the brick buildings with a warm golden glow, but the shadows between the people were growing longer every year. For decades, an invisible line had been drawn down the center of the main street, separating families who had once shared Sunday dinners but now barely traded nods. You could see it in the way people crossed the street to avoid a neighbor, or the sharp, guarded glances exchanged over coffee at the local diner. The air felt heavy, not with humidity, but with the weight of unspoken grievances and assumptions that had hardened into local gospel. Martha sat on her porch, her hands wrapped around a weathered ceramic mug, watching the neighborhood wake up in a series of choreographed avoidances. She noticed how young parents pulled their children closer when walking past certain houses, and how the older men at the park sat on opposite ends of the same bench, staring into the distance. It was a beautiful spring morning, with the scent of blooming lilacs drifting on the breeze, but the human landscape felt desolate and cold. Martha had lived through 80 years of seasons, and she knew that a garden left untended eventually turns into a thicket of thorns that chokes out the light. She spent the afternoon in her kitchen, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, highlighting the little dust motes dancing like tiny sparkles in the air. Her table was covered in old stationery, and a list of names most folks in Oakhaven wouldn't even whisper in the same breath. These were the leaders of the town's quiet war, the loud voices on social media, the organizers of rival protests, and the men who had stopped speaking over a fence line years ago. Martha's pen didn't shake as she wrote the invitations, her handwriting elegant and firm, gently requesting their presence for a meal on her front lawn. The delivery of the invitations was done by hand, Martha walking the cracked sidewalks with a basket of envelopes as if she were merely sharing garden seeds. She didn't stay to argue or explain when she saw the confusion and immediate defensiveness in their eyes as they read her note. She simply offered a small, knowing smile and a gentle reminder that the food would be hot and the chairs would be waiting. By the time she returned home, the town's digital grapevine was already buzzing with the news of her impossible dinner party. Most people laughed at the idea, calling it a foolish errand for an old woman who had finally lost touch with the reality of their divided world. As the day of the dinner arrived, Martha began hauling her heavy oak dining table out onto the grass, the legs sinking slightly into the soft green earth. She didn't ask for help, knowing that the sight of her working alone would be the first mirror the town would have to look into. Neighbors watched from behind lace curtains and cracked garage doors, seeing a lone woman in a floral apron arranging mismatched chairs in a long, defiant line. The table was covered in a white linen cloth that caught the breeze like a sail, appearing bright and hopeful against the backdrop of the gray, weathered street. She spent hours preparing the meal, filling the neighborhood with the scent of roasting chicken, garlic, and fresh rosemary. It was the kind of aroma that bypasses the brain and goes straight to the heart, reminding everyone who smelled it of a time when things were simpler. Martha set the table with her best china, the gold-rimmed plates shimmering under the softening afternoon light. She placed a single wildflower in a small glass at each setting, a tiny gesture of beauty intended to soften the hard edges of the people who were about to occupy the seats. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burning orange as the first guest appeared at the edge of the lawn. It was Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the scowl of 1,000 political arguments, standing awkwardly with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the empty chairs and then at Martha, his defensive posture softening just a little when she greeted him by his first name. He took a seat at the far end of the table, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were waiting for a storm to break over the rooftops. Soon others began to trickle in, their arrivals marked by a heavy, suffocating silence that felt louder than any shouting match. Sarah, a young activist known for her fiery speeches, sat directly across from David, the man she had campaigned against for months. They didn't look at each other, instead focusing intently on the silverware or the way the light caught the condensation on their water glasses. The surrounding neighbors had gathered on the fringes of the lawn, a silent audience watching this social experiment with a mixture of pity and intense, hidden curiosity. Martha emerged from the house carrying a large, steaming tureen, her presence the only thing keeping the fragile piece from shattering into 100 pieces. She didn't start with a prayer or a lecture. She simply began serving the food, the clinking of ladles against porcelain the only sound in the twilight. The steam rose between the guests, momentarily blurring the sharp lines of their faces and forcing them to acknowledge the person sitting inches away. As the plates were filled, the physical necessity of eating forced the guests to lower their guards, if only to pick up a fork and taste the salt. For the first 20 minutes, the only dialogue was the polite, strained request for the butter or the passing of the salt shaker. It was the nice behavior Martha had expected, the thin veneer of civility that people use to mask the deep-seated resentment boiling underneath. She watched them carefully, seeing the way their eyes darted toward one another and then quickly away, afraid of what a lingering look might reveal. The tension was a living thing, sitting at the table like an uninvited guest, making every breath feel deliberate and every movement feel like a tactical maneuver. Finally, Martha set her own fork down and looked at the group, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight she had just sparked. She didn't ask them to be friends, and she didn't ask them to agree on the issues that had torn the town apart for a generation. Instead, she asked a single question that had nothing to do with politics or property lines. Tell me about the first time you felt like you didn't belong in this town. The question hung in the air, glowing softly like a lantern in a quiet room, a sharp contrast to the superficial small talk, asking for a kind of honesty none of them had prepared to give. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge that no one was quite brave enough to cross yet. David cleared his throat, his fingers tracing a chip in the rim of his plate as he debated whether to retreat into anger or lean into the truth. The neighbors on the sidewalk leaned in, the glow from the streetlights catching the collective breath of a community, waiting to see if the first stone would be thrown or turned into a step. Martha waited, her face a portrait of patient, unwavering empathy, knowing that the most important stories always begin with a moment of terrifying vulnerability. David finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, as he described the loneliness of returning home from the military to a town that felt like it had moved on without him. He talked about the quiet sting of being ignored at the grocery store, and how that isolation slowly turned into a bitter need to fight for a place that no longer felt like home. Across from him, Sarah's expression softened, shifting from guarded defiance to a tiny flicker of recognition, like a lantern warming in the dark. Her own memories of being an outsider bubbled up, gentle and sharp all at once. The enemy wasn't a monster at all. He was a man who was just as afraid of being forgotten as she was of being silenced. As the table grew still, as David's words settled into the grass, the weight of his honesty acting like an anchor in the shifting evening breeze, Sarah, who had spent months preparing rebuttals for every point David made in public, found her mouth dry and her arguments suddenly feeling like heavy, useless armor. She looked at his hands, rough, calloused, and trembling just a legal amount, and realized she had never actually looked at him as a person before, only as an obstacle. The surrounding darkness of the yard seemed to shrink, bringing the small circle of candlelight into a sharper, more intimate focus that made hiding impossible. "I thought you hated us," Sarah said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge, sounding instead like a tired child seeking an answer. She described her own night spent crying over hateful messages left on her porch, explaining how her passion for the town came from a deep fear that her own children would never feel safe in their own skin. As she spoke, the rigid posture of the other guests began to soften, the us versus them mentality crumbling under the weight of shared exhaustion. They weren't debating policy anymore. They were acknowledging the bruises they had all been nursing in the dark. Miller, the oldest man at the table, let out a long, shuddering breath, the kind that trembles through the air like a dam finally bursting after years of pressure. He spoke of the town's history, of the factories that had closed, and how the sense of community had slipped away with the jobs, leaving behind a hollowed-out resentment. He admitted it was easier to be angry at his neighbors than to feel sad about the world changing in ways he couldn't control or understand. And as he spoke, the bitterness in his eyes began to soften, glazing over with a reflective sheen, the flickering candles revealing the exhaustion tucked behind his practiced scowl. As the stories continued to pour out, the nice masks were discarded entirely, replaced by the raw, messy reality of human experience. People who hadn't spoken in a decade were suddenly leaning forward, their faces softly lit by the warm glow of Martha's lanterns, realizing almost with a hush that they shared the same anxieties about the future. The conversation was no longer a series of attacks, but a gentle, collective exhale of spirits that had been held tight for far too long. They spoke of lost loved ones, of failed businesses, and of the quiet moments of beauty they all still found in the local woods, finding common ground in the very earth they sat upon. Martha moved quietly around the table, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, her presence a gentle glow in the middle of all that unfolding honesty. She noticed the moment when two men who had argued over a property line for years finally met each other's eyes. And in that tiny nod they shared, there was more truth than any legal paper could ever hold. The air felt lighter now, almost sparkling, the heavy tension drifting away and leaving behind a bright, curious energy, as if everyone there was seeing their little town for the very first time. And the shadows on the lawn, they weren't hiding spots anymore, but soft, cozy blankets for a group of people who were finally finding their way home to themselves. A younger man named Leo, who had remained silent most of the night, finally spoke up about the pressure of trying to stay neutral in a town that demanded you pick a side. He described the suffocating feeling of walking through the park and knowing that a smile directed at one person was seen as a betrayal by another. His words resonated with the younger guests, who nodded in a silent, somber rhythm, their faces glowing with the relief of finally hearing their own internal struggles voiced out loud. The table had become a sanctuary, where the complexity of their lives was finally allowed to exist without judgment. The neighbors who had been watching from the street began to slowly drift closer, the pull of the genuine emotion acting like a magnet in the quiet night. They stood at the edge of the lawn, not as spectators to a fight, but as witnesses to a healing they didn't know was possible. The soft murmur of voices from the table drifted up toward the stars, a human melody that contrasted beautifully with the distant, mechanical hum of the city. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, only the low, steady vibration of people trying to understand the geography of each other's hearts. Tears began to fall, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen and heard after years of being a caricature in someone else's mind. David reached across the linen cloth, his hand hesitating for a second before resting briefly on the table near Sarah's, a gesture of peace that felt more powerful than any signed treaty. They were discovering that their differences hadn't changed, but their perspective had, shifting from a focus on the wall to a focus on the people standing on the other side of it. The garden, bathed in the soft light of the moon, felt like a holy place where the old world was being tilled under to make room for something new. The conversation shifted toward the small things they could actually agree on. The need for a safe playground, the beauty of the annual harvest festival, and the simple desire to walk down the street without a racing heart. These tiny, everyday dreams felt like little stitches, gently tugging the fabric of the community back together, one shared hope at a time. They realized that while they might never agree on the how, they deeply agreed on the why, rooted in a shared love for the place they called home. The candlelight shimmered softly, catching the sparkles of salt and tears on the table, turning the remnants of the meal into a quiet mosaic of reconciliation. Martha sat back in her chair, a tired but profound sense of peace settling into her bones as she watched the miracle of human connection. She didn't need to lead the conversation anymore. The momentum of truth had taken over, carrying them all toward a shore they hadn't believed existed. The night air was cool, but the heat coming from the gathered bodies and the open hearts made the lawn feel like the warmest place on earth. She looked up at the darkened windows of the houses nearby, knowing that the light starting here would eventually find its way into every room in Oakhaven. One by one, the guests began to help Martha clear the table, the act of service becoming a soft, final ritual for the evening. There was a new gentleness in their movements, a carefulness with the plates, and with each other that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. They moved in a quiet, synchronized dance of shared labor, the clinking of dishes turning into a rhythmic little song of cooperation instead of a jarring noise of conflict. The enemies were now just people holding opposite ends of a heavy table, their muscles working together as they carried the weight back into the house. As the last of the dishes were taken inside, the guests lingered on the porch, loath to leave the bubble of authenticity they had created together. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, and the stars seemed to pulse with a renewed clarity above the sleeping town. They exchanged phone numbers and promises of coffee, not with the hollow tone of social obligation, but with the desperate sincerity of people who had found a lifeline. The walls hadn't vanished completely, but they had been lowered enough for them to see the sunrise that was surely coming. Martha stood in the doorway, the yellow light from the hallway silhouetting her small frame as she waved goodbye to the departing group. She watched as Miller and David walked toward their cars, stopping for a moment under a street lamp to shake hands, a silhouette of two men finding a middle ground in the dark. The silence of the neighborhood was now a peaceful one, a quiet that felt like a long-awaited rest after a fever had finally broken. She knew the morning would bring challenges, and that the town wouldn't be fixed overnight. But the seeds were in the ground, and the ground had been softened by tears. She walked back to her empty table on the lawn, the white cloth glowing faintly in the moonlight, like a little ghost of the evening's grace. She picked up a single fallen wildflower and held it to her chest, feeling the quiet thrum of a victory that didn't need a loser at all. The town of Oakhaven was still divided by many things, but tonight, the most important boundary had been crossed, the one that lives between the stories we tell about people and the people themselves. Martha blew out the last candle, the smoke rising in a thin, elegant curl toward the heavens, like a final tiny prayer for a town that was finally learning how to breathe. The following morning, the sun rose over Oakhaven, not with a dramatic flare, but with a soft, steady persistence that illuminated the dew on Martha's lawn. The deep indentations where the table legs had sunk into the grass remained, small physical reminders of the weight that had been shared there the night before. Martha stood at her kitchen window, watching the town stir to life, noticing how the familiar rhythm of the street felt subtly altered, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean. There was no magic transformation, but there was a new stillness, a sense that the frantic energy of conflict had finally exhausted itself. A few doors down, Miller stepped out to retrieve his newspaper, his usual scowl softened into a look of deep, quiet contemplation as he peeked toward Martha's house. And when he saw David driving by on his way to work, the usual tension didn't coil in his chest. Instead, he lifted a hand in a hesitant but gentle little wave. David slowed his truck, returning the gesture with a firm nod before rolling down the road again, the exchange lasting only seconds, but feeling like a monumental shift in the town's geography. It was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall that had stood for years, proving that recognition is the first step toward reconciliation. At the local park, Sarah sat on a bench, watching her children play while she scrolled through the comments on a community forum that had once been a digital battlefield. She found herself typing a response to a controversial post, but instead of using the sharp, biting wit she was known for, she chose words that were measured and curious. She noticed that when she stopped treating every disagreement as a war, the voices on the other side began to lose their jagged edges as well. The sunlight filtering through the oak trees felt warmer on her skin, reflecting the internal thaw that had begun at Martha's candlelit table. The news of the dinner spread through the town like a gentle ripple rather than a crashing wave, whispered over backyard fences and discussed in low tones at the pharmacy. People began to realize that the enemies among them were actually suffering from the same loneliness and the same desire to be understood. Conversations that had been avoided for a decade started to happen in small pockets, at the post office, in the grocery aisles, and on the very sidewalks that had once been lines of demarcation. It wasn't that everyone suddenly agreed on everything, but they had agreed that the person standing in front of them mattered more than the argument between them. By mid-afternoon, Martha was back in her garden, her hands deep in the warm, fragrant soil as she tended to the flowers that had witnessed the previous night's honesty. She looked up to see a small group of neighbors approaching her porch, carrying plates of cookies and handwritten notes of thanks for the courage she had shown. They didn't come with grand speeches, just a simple acknowledgement that she had given them permission to be human again in a world that demanded they be symbols. Martha smiled, her weathered face glowing with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who knows that the hardest part of planting is simply breaking the surface. As the weeks passed, the Dinner of Enemies became a cornerstone of Oakhaven's identity. A story told to newcomers not as a legend, but as a practice. And soon, little tables began appearing on other lawns, like tiny invitations to kindness. The town council meetings grew less about winning and more about finding the most sustainable path forward for everyone. The sharp, bright colors of the town's murals seemed more vibrant now, no longer clashing but blending into a tapestry that celebrated the complexity of their shared life. And though the shadow of the old divisions remained, it was no longer a place where people lived. It was simply a place they had passed through. The local high school held a forum where students were encouraged to share their own real stories, inspired by the vulnerability they had seen in the adults around them. And seeing the younger generation embrace the idea of authenticity, it gave the town a sense of hope that felt sturdier than any political promise. The walls were still there in some places, but they were being decorated with art and softened by climbing ivy, turned from barriers into landmarks of growth. Oakhaven was becoming a place where the truth didn't have to be a weapon, but could instead be the very foundation upon which they built their future. On the 1-month anniversary of the dinner, Martha hosted another gathering, but this time the lawn was crowded with people from every corner of the town, bringing their own chairs and their own stories. There was laughter, the kind that comes from the belly and echoes off the brick walls, and there were tears that were shed openly without shame. The sunset that evening was a masterpiece of gold and rose, casting a long, warm light over a community that had finally learned that nice is a shadow of what real can achieve. They sat together under the vast, darkening sky, a mosaic of different lives finally fitting together in a way that felt like home. Martha sat in her favorite rocker on the porch, watching the sea of faces illuminated by the soft glow of 100 small lanterns. She knew that conflict would return, as it always does in human affairs. But she also knew that the people of Oakhaven now held the tools to dismantle the walls before they grew too high. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the symphony of voices, the apologies, the questions, and the shared dreams, and felt the deep, steady pulse of a town that had finally found its heart. The flame she had lit in the dark had grown into a warmth that would sustain them through every coming season. As we often wait for a grand miracle to heal our world, we forget that the most powerful medicine is often found in the simple act of listening without a shield. And when we choose to be real instead of just being right, we create a space where the impossible becomes the inevitable.